The prophecy has been foretold. I'm going to tell you exactly who the Falcons are going to take with all 7 of their 2023 NFL draft picks.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and, of course, the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who can take you on the journey of self-discovery wherever you are. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. And we thank everyone that makes this illustrious podcast their first listen. Please make sure you subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we will do a complete 7-round mock draft for the Falcons. These are my actual projections on which players I think they will take in this draft. We'll see how accurate this is come Thursday night. We will not spend much time talking about Casey Hayward's release, in part due to we've touched upon it before. We probably will go deeper into it on tomorrow's episode, but we've talked about how Casey Hayward was potentially a cut, at the outset of free agency, potentially a cut after the draft. I think Jeff Okudah gives them an option at that outside corner opposite AJ Terrell. That's the idea behind that trade. I think they will potentially add another option in the draft at the cornerback position, but a lot of it will depend on how the board is going to fall. And while I do think cornerback is still an option for the Falcons in round 1, I don't think it's likely that we will see the team pull the trigger. And that is owed to what I expect from the first 7 picks in this year's draft. And I think we'll see 3 quarterbacks go in the top 7 this year before the Falcons are on the clock. Bryce Young will be one of those quarterbacks. Who the other 2 are, I don't know. My guess is CJ Stroud of Ohio State will be one of those other 2 quarterbacks, but really don't know. And who and where they're going outside of Bryce Young to Carolina is anybody's guess. The Raiders, the Seahawks, the Colts, the Texans, who knows is going to be picking those guys. But, I think with 3 quarterbacks off the board, the other 4 non-quarterbacks that will go off the board in the top 7, as we, talk about who's going to be available for the Falcons at 8, I expect that to be Will Anderson out of Alabama, probably either Houston, Arizona, or Seattle will take him. Tyree Wilson of Texas Tech, either Houston or Seattle will take him. Devin Witherspoon, the cornerback from Illinois. Feels like everybody's thinking that Detroit is going to pick him at that 6 overall spot. And then Christian Gonzalez, the Oregon corner, seems like he'll wind up either with the Cardinals or with the Raiders in some form or fashion. And for that reason, that's why I don't think cornerback is likely to be the Falcons pick, even though I think the Falcons will be interested in both Witherspoon and Gonzalez with the release of Casey Hayward. But with both those guys off the board, I think the Falcons will wait till their cornerback later in the draft. So this scenario that I see playing out for the upcoming draft, it does mean Jalen Carter, the Georgia defensive tackle, will be on the board for the Falcons at 8, but I do not expect the Falcons to take Jalen Carter with that selection. That's just a gut feeling I have. I just think they will pass on, arguably the best player in this draft class, and that will leave the Falcons, sitting there mulling over 2 players for this 8th overall selection. That is Northwestern offensive lineman Peter Skoronski. That is Georgia pass rusher Nolan Smith. Now, logically, to me, Skoronski makes the most sense based off of what I've told on this podcast previously. The Falcons tend to go chalk with their draft picks, meaning that they don't stray too far from consensus. And the consensus is pretty much universally Peter Skoronski is considered one of the 8 to 10 best prospects in this draft class. That is not the case for Nolan Smith, although some people do rate him that highly. That is not the consensus. The consensus is that he's probably somewhere in the 15 to 25 range. But I think in Skoronski, given you have a hole at left guard where I think he's a plug-and-play starter at that left guard position, upgrade over Matt Hennessy, a long-term solution. But we know the Falcons have already used some draft capital at that left guard position with Jalen Mayfield, their 3rd-round pick in 2021, with Justin Shaver, their 6th-round pick in 2022. Will they continue to spend draft capital on that position? Who knows? I hope they do. in this scenario. If we're not getting Jalen Carter, who would be my choice if I was running the Falcons war room, to me, Skoronski is a layup of a pick for the Falcons at that spot, and you get a plug and play starter for the next decade on your offensive line where you need it. But I don't think the Falcons are going to go in that direction. And I think they'll wind up taking Nolan Smith. And it's funny because, if they take Peter Skoronski, that basically means that they're relegating Jalen Mayfield, their third round pick from 2021, to probably a career as a backup. And if they take Nolan Smith, that probably means that they're relegating D'Angelo Malone, their third round pick from last year, for his career as a backup, because Nolan Smith is going to play that Sam linebacker role that Lorenzo Carter and D'Angelo Malone seemingly are penciled in for. And I've said before on the podcast, it doesn't make a lot of sense logically, in my opinion, for the Falcons to take a third Sam linebacker that's not going to bring anything additional to the table that you don't have between Malone, Carter, Caden Ellis, Arnold Ebiketie, Bud Dupree. You already have that skill set on your roster. And so to me, I don't know if Smith adds a whole lot to this team, but Falcon's going to Falcon. And, I've done a lot of soul searching over the last 5 to 6 days over the idea of the Falcons taking Nolan Smith. I was incredulous, 5-6 days ago. And over the last 3 or 4 days, been trying to wrap my head around it. And I think you're getting a good player that has pass rushing upside, but I don't know if that's a player that I would consider to be a cornerstone of your roster, which is typically what you want to get with a top 10 selection. And, that's what I see Skoronski being. That's what I see Jalen Carter being. I don't know if Nolan Smith is going to be that player, but he, of course, has the makeup that Terry Fontenot is constantly talking about when he's talking about how they evaluate players. Everybody gives Nolan Smith, A++ character boxes, checks those boxes from a character standpoint, from a work ethic standpoint, all those various things. Nolan Smith is going to be a coach one day. I don't know if it's going to be a head coach, a D coordinator, or whatever, but I'm pretty sure I'll be telling my grandkids or whatever, 35 years from now. And I remember when the Falcons took Nolan Smith in the first round. He was a young pup and whippersnapper, and now he's the best DC or head coach or whatever in the game. So that is the future for Nolan Smith off the field, but on the field, I think he can provide some value, but I sort of see him as a single that has the potential, to be a triple, but I don't think that potential is particularly high. Skoronski to me is an absolute double that has the potential to be a triple and very likely to be a triple. Jalen Carter, of course, has that potential to be a home run pick for the Falcons, but obviously has the baggage that comes with that. And part of the reason why I don't expect the Falcons to take Jalen Carter is, there's potential civil lawsuit coming from, that incident in January, that car accident that cost the lives of Devin Willock, his teammate at Georgia, and Chandler Lecrae, a Georgia staffer. And I just can't imagine a world where Arthur Smith will invite the idea that he has to go into a press conference and answer a question about Jalen Carter missing practice because he's got a court date or something like that. I know Arthur Smith has no desire to want to do that. And so for that reason, I would be surprised at the Falcons, pleasantly surprised, if they pull the trigger on a Jalen Carter at that 8th overall spot. And so I do kind of expect the team to take Nolan Smith. It'll be kind of karma from last year where I wanted the team to kind of reach on a pass rusher at 8 with Jermaine Johnson, and they didn't do that. And now it's like, okay, well, now they're going to kind of do that with Nolan Smith, in my humble opinion. But I did do some research over the weekend, and I've come around a little bit on Nolan Smith. Because there was a player a couple of years ago that I wanted the Falcons to draft that I thought would be a similar player to Nolan Smith that I thought the Falcons should take in the first round. He's coming off a breakout 2022 season. And I think if Nolan Smith follows a similar career path, I can better get behind this selection for him at 8 if he turns into this player. And that player I'm referring to is Josh Uche, and we'll break down the parallels between Nolan Smith and Uche, the current New England Patriot, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But I want to tell you guys that today's episode is sponsored by BetterHelp, and you've heard me talk about how therapy has really benefited me over the last several months, and that's thanks to BetterHelp. Therapy has helped me understand things like I can only control the things that I can control, and I don't control whether or not the Falcons draft a good player or they draft a player I like or even win a football game on some Sunday this fall or winter. But the thing I can control is the quality of the podcast. And I've gotten a lot of feedback from you guys over the last year that, the podcast has improved, and you can owe that somewhat to BetterHelp. And therapy is about deepening your self-awareness and understanding about yourself. And BetterHelp is going to help you connect with a licensed therapist who can take you on that journey of self-discovery wherever you are. And if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and you'll get matched with a licensed therapist within 48 hours. And you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Discover your potential with BetterHelp by visiting betterhelp.com/lockedon today, and you'll get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. So, guys, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, I do want to let you guys know that the Locked On NFL mock draft special is already here. And if you missed it last weekend, you can go check it out on Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube, as well as Locked On NFL, giving you, all 32 teams' first picks in a 6-episode ultimate mock draft experience that only Locked On can deliver. So go check it out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So I've talked before about not necessarily being high on the type of pass rusher that Nolan Smith is. That is that undersized 240-pound guy that brings a lot of speed, a lot of bend, explosiveness. But I do think the problem he's going to face in the NFL is that playing against the bigger offensive tackles that he'll see, most Sundays, is that once those guys get their hands on him, he's going to have a lot of trouble. And we saw this issue be an issue with Vic Beasley. I don't think it will be as much an issue with Nolan Smith as it was with Vic Beasley, because I don't have the same questions about Nolan Smith's core strength like I had with Vic Beasley when he was coming out of Clemson so many years ago. But I still think it's going to be an issue. And for those reasons, I tend to not value undersized edge rushers as much as maybe some other people do. And in the process of this weekend, I was doing some research looking at sub 250-pound edge rushers that were taken in the top 100 over the last 10 years. Because my perception was that the only successful guys that are built like Nolan Smith currently in the league are guys like Hassan Reddick and Micah Parsons. And the thing that stands out about those two guys is they didn't really enter the NFL as pass rushers. They were entered the NFL as off-ball linebackers, and then eventually were moved to be more of an edge rusher and pass rusher first because they had, obviously the skill set to be very successful there. And so my perception was that, the two successful Nolan Smith type of players are kind of outliers for that reason, because they weren't initially projected to be pass rushers, but then turned into good pass rushers. And so the idea I had in doing this research was every team that has actually drafted a guy with the intention of that guy being a pass rusher has not reached the level of success that they wanted. So that gave me a lot of pause with this. That point is certainly still debatable, and we'll probably spend a lot of time over the next 6 weeks talking about that possibility if Nolan Smith winds up being the pick. But in the process of doing this research, I did come across two smaller edge rushers that I was a fan of in recent drafts, and that was Josh Uche and Nick Bonito. Josh Uche was a late second-round pick for the Patriots in 2020. Bonito was a late second-round pick with the Broncos this past year. And Uche in particular was a player that back in the 2020 pre-draft cycle, when everybody was talking about, especially before free agency, talking about K'Lavon Chaisson or AJ Epinesa for the Falcons at that pick 16, it was Uche to me that was the guy that I actually liked a little bit more and thought was higher on than a player like Chaisson. And of course that went away once the Falcons spent all that money on Dante Fowler and pretty much killed any hopes and dreams for the Falcons to use one of those premium picks on a pass rusher. But what's notable about that offseason is that was the COVID offseason. So Uche didn't really work out. And while I don't know if Uche would have ran a 4.39 like Nolan Smith, I do think he probably would have ran in the 4.4s. And so we look at Nolan Smith as this one-of-one athlete. And I don't know if he is. He's maybe one of two, because I think Uche could have given him a run for his money, but we didn't necessarily see that. And Uche in the NFL dealt with injuries a lot in his first 2 years. This past year was his healthiest season, and he broke out with an 11.5 sack season, despite the fact that he didn't get a ton of playing time, right? He averaged about 20 snaps a game this past year, which is similar to the workload that Arnold Ebiketie got this past year, yet he produced 5 times as many sacks as Arnold Ebiketie and 2 times as many pressures as Ebiketie. And that's not a shot at Ebiketie, just a testament to how much productive Josh Uche was in a limited workload this past season. It was one of the top producers in the NFL this past season as a pass rusher. And the reason I bring this up is because of the whole outlier thing, right? Basically, as I discussed, when you look at the 240-pound edges, there aren't a lot of guys that have had success over the last couple of decades. I mentioned Hassan Reddick, I've mentioned Micah Parsons, and then other than that, it's like basically Robert Mathis, and that's about it, right? And so finding another player like a Josh Uche, who seemingly, took a big step and was ascending as one of the top pass rushers in the league last year, to me is important because it means there's a middle ground. And calling Uche a middle ground is probably not fair because he in fact had a higher pressure rate last year than both Parsons and Hassan Reddick did, and his win rate, according to Pro Football Focus, was the fourth highest in the NFL this past year, behind guys like Myles Garrett and Joey Bosa. But it's important, in my opinion, to find more examples of these undersized edge rushers finding success in the league in order for me to be more open to the idea that a player like Nolan Smith, who I typically don't necessarily love, could be more successful than my initial biases indicate. And so I don't know if Nolan Smith is as good a prospect as I personally thought Uche was coming out, when I thought he was a legit candidate to be a late first round pick, because I thought Uche was a more refined, polished pass rusher coming out of Michigan than what I think Nolan Smith is at this point in time. Now, maybe that opinion changes if and when I do a deep dive on Nolan Smith after he's the pick for the Falcons after the draft. But it felt like Uche was able to win in multiple ways, while Nolan Smith basically wins primarily by first step quickness, speed around the edge, and or effort. Right. And that's more reminiscent to me a little bit of Nick Bonito. So if I was putting them on a spectrum and Uche was at one end of the spectrum and Bonito was at the other end of the spectrum, I think Nolan Smith personally is probably somewhere in between those guys. And again, that's not typically a guy that I would value in the top 10, but of course, there was a time where I did value that as a potential top 20, 25-ish pick. And so for me, at least, I will lose less sleep if Nolan Smith is the pick, because it basically can go back to that mindset I was in like February and March of 2020 of believing and hoping that, okay, Josh Uche is going to be the pick. And so now I can be like, okay, well, that dream didn't come to fruition. And now we can correct history, right? We can go back in time and get the guy I kind of wanted the team to get back in 2020. No complaints about AJ Terrell by any means. Trust me on that one. But like, it's just kind of a revisionist history, right? And so if I look at Nolan Smith as a Josh Uche type, I can get more behind this pick, even if that may not be necessarily a selling point for many of you guys. Like, oh, you're comparing this guy to a late second round pick. That doesn't make me feel better about the top 10 pick. And it is what it is. But just go watch some Josh Uche highlights and be like, okay, Nolan Smith might be able to do that. And then I think you'll get behind it. So we'll see. We'll see with Nolan Smith if he can climb that hill. I think he does have a steeper hill to climb to be a top 10 caliber player at his respective position, like a Hassan Reddick, like a Micah Parsons, and arguably like a Josh Uche may solidify himself this year in a sort of a contract year. So we'll see if he has that expanded role this year with the Patriots, and if his production dips or continues to play at a high level. Does he get a second contract on the Patriots? Does he get a second contract elsewhere? That would be something to keep an eye on this season. But I do think Smith has a steep hill to climb in order to project him as one of the top 10 edge rushers in the NFL. I don't think that hill is as steep to climb if you're looking at players like Jalen Carter, him being one of the 10 best interior D linemen in the league, or Peter Skoronski being one of the 10 best guards in the NFL. And that's why I feel much better about the Falcons pulling the trigger on those guys in round one than I would be with Nolan Smith. But at least, again, like, okay, there's a path there if he follows the Josh Uche blueprint. So we'll see if Nolan Smith can do that. And we'll wrap up today's episode projecting the rest of the Falcons pick if and after Nolan Smith is their first round pick in this year's draft. And we'll get into all of that, guys, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, before we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, I want to give a shout out to all my everydayers that make Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day, whether you subscribe on YouTube or on your other everyday, podcast platform. Really shout out to all the guys 5 days a week. And if you guys are not listening 5 days a week, you got to step your game up. And especially you want to listen all day this week because, we're not taking any breaks, right? Once the weekend hits, we're going, 13 days straight or whatever the math is, 12 days straight, I guess it was, over the next couple of days. So no breaks. So everybody, make sure you make Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. So if we're imagining a world where Nolan Smith is the first round pick, I think they got to get some size after that point, and I think round 2 is a great opportunity to do so. And the player I think the Falcons will probably wind up taking at 44th overall pick is Keanu Benton, the D tackle from Wisconsin. Benton spent a lot of his career at Wisconsin playing nose tackles, but he also played some 3 technique. I think he has the flexibility to play 5 technique, even if he doesn't have necessarily experience to do so. It was very impressive. Working the one-on-ones at the Senior Bowl, was consistently one of the more effective players in those one-on-one reps. And so I think you can pencil in Benton across the board for their D-line. He could be a potential Eddie Goldman replacement as that 1 tech nose tackle. He could be a eventual Calais Campbell replacement as that 5 tech defensive end, as well as getting those opportunities on passing downs to spell guys like Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata as well. And so, especially if the Falcons are probably with this Nolan Smith pick, going to embrace more of a 3-4 look up front as their base package, having a player like Keanu Benton who has that versatility to play all of those spots on the D-line, to me makes a ton of sense. Now in round 3, this to me is the sweet spot for the Falcons to nab a receiver. And I think that player is going to be Rashee Rice, a wide receiver out of Southern Methodist. And I think, there are players like Rice and Jonathan Mingo and Tyler Scott that I typically pencil in for the Falcons, who's going to be there at that 75th overall pick. I feel like Rice is probably the best bet out of those 3 guys that will probably still be on the board at 75. He's a bigger possession receiver that wins contested catch situations, and he can block. So, that's the Falcons' MO at the wide receiver position. And even if I would much rather have players like Mingo and Scott that bring a little bit more juice to the position than Rice does, the Falcons going to Falcon, as I said multiple times now on the podcast. So moving into round 4, I think their pick is going to be on the defensive side of the ball. My projection is they'll probably go linebacker and DB here. The linebacker I have them going is Owen Popo, the linebacker out of Auburn, and the DB I think is going to be Kei'Trel Clark, the cornerback out of Louisville. Popo is a explosive, hard-nosed linebacker. He's going to have depth at the linebacker position. He can play special teams, did that at college, will do so early, and will basically be penciled in as their top backup as that linebacker position long-term, and maybe eventually develop into a starter, next to Troy Anderson or whatever by the end of his rookie contract. I think that's kind of the goal for him. And Clark is an undersized guy, probably will play nickel, but does have experience playing on the outside at Louisville. I think he's your long-term answer at that nickel cornerback position. Allegedly, the Falcons were very big fans of his at the Shrine Bowl. So I think he can come in, immediately push guys like Mike Hughes and D. Alford for that nickel cornerback spot and give them an option there. And that could also allow Mike Hughes to move more to the outside, where he can push someone like Jeff Okudah to replace Casey Hayward. And you could have Clark and Alford as your primary competitors at the nickel, and Hughes and Okudah as your primary competitors at the outside corner. And that's notable because Hughes historically has been a more effective outside corner in his career than he has been as a nickel corner. So that's why I think the Falcons may lean nickel in this draft with someone like Kei'Trel Clark. Now, the Falcons don't have another pick until round 7. And so I think this is an ideal scenario where the Falcons at some point in this draft, maybe in round 2, maybe in round 3, possibly in round 1, certainly I would feel a lot better about the Falcons taking Nolan Smith in round 1 if they were able to trade back. And given the circumstances that I outlined earlier, where I do think that 4th quarterback will be available, does a team like Tennessee at 11 come up? Does a team like Houston at 12 want to come up? Or do we see a team like Washington at 16 potentially come up? Doesn't seem likely, but we'll sort of have to see about that. And if the Falcons can move back, pick up some day 2 picks and as well as some day 3 picks, I think that makes a ton of sense rather than having to wait around to not pick again until round 7. So we'll see if the Falcons can get some, extra 5th and 6th round picks by maneuvering on draft day. But for round 7, with the 2 picks the Falcons have, I have them selecting Chamari Connor, the safety out of Virginia Tech, and Trevor Reed, an offensive tackle out of Louisville. Connor's a versatile guy, can play single high, can play in the slot, can play in the box. Was a special teams maven at Virginia Tech. You can sort of pencil him in immediately as your 4th safety. Presumably he'll take over as that 3rd safety in their dime looks, in their big nickel looks, next year with Jalen Hawkins entering a contract year this year. So it makes a lot of sense to me with Chamari Connor. I think, again, ideally the Falcons might get a safety earlier in the draft than this point, but at some point they got to get a safety. So Connor, I think, has a chance to fall to round 7, although I think current projections are putting him in that 5th, 6th round range. So again, that's why I think it's important for the Falcons to get more ammunition in that range. And Reed is just a raw athletic, tackle that has experience in the outside zone scheme, more of a developmental piece, a long-term swing tackle that maybe, if Dwayne Ledford can work his miracles, 2-3 years from now could be a legit option for the Falcons to, plug in as a starter, as a eventual heir apparent for Jake Matthews and or Caleb McGarry. That's kind of what Reed is, just a kind of developmental guy that you want to take a flyer on to see if you can, get something out of him in the future. So we'll see about that. Those are my projections for the Falcons. As a reminder, Nolan Smith, the outside linebacker from Georgia, Keanu Bitten, the D tackle for Wisconsin in round 2, Rasheed Rice, the wide receiver from SMU in round 3. Round 4 is Owen Popo, the linebacker from Auburn, and Kei'trel Clark, the corner from Louisville. In the 7th round picks of Chamari Connor, the safety from Virginia Tech, and Trevor Reed, the tackle from Louisville as well. So this is all part of me kind of setting my expectations low, right? Like, we've had such a good offseason here in Atlanta that it's like you got to come back down to earth at some point being a Falcon fan, right? That is something that, despite being in therapy and it's helped me, there still is a strong pessimism streak in me. I just sort of keep it tamped down, but it's been too good of an off season, and it's just like, okay, well, if you love the free agency, then you're going to be disappointed with the draft pick, right? And if you hated free agency, then you're going to love the draft pick. That's usually how it goes here in Atlanta. So that's kind of where I'm at, why I'm leaning towards Nolan Smith. I have to set my expectations low. Now, I will love to be pleasantly surprised by the Falcons taking, a Jalen Carter or Peter Skoronski or even one of the premier corners in this draft at 8. That would make me feel a lot better than what I feel about Nolan Smith. But as I say, Falcons going to Falcons. So that's going to do it for us here, guys. We'll get more into Casey Hayward's release tomorrow and take a deeper look at what their plans are to potentially replace him via the draft, looking beyond corners like Kei'trel Clark, potentially some day 2 options for them. That will be maybe an opportunity to have Savion Mixon back on the show to talk about some of the safeties that could provide that sort of dime big nickel flexibility. We'll get into that. And you'll probably note that I did not project the Falcons to take a running back. That may be also a topic that we get into later this week with some guests as well in the lead up to the draft. But we only got a couple more days, guys. We're just kind of waiting and seeing. All the buzz seems to be pointing in Nolan Smith's direction. To me, logically, Peter Skoronski makes a way more sense, but there's absolutely no buzz for Skoronski at this point in time. So we'll see how it all plays out. And there you guys have it. I've given you all the picks that the Falcons will actually make. I wish it was, if this winds up being, I go 7 for 7, then I want all of you guys to worship me, whatever. I'm sorry. I'm losing it at the end of the show. So that's it, guys. Really appreciate you tuning in for another episode. Make sure you check out the Locked On Ultimate Mock Draft. Make sure you check out Locked On NFL Draft, Locked On NFL Scouting with Kyle Krabs, Joe Marino as well. I'll give you an update later this week on what exactly our plans are for the content that we're going to have pre and post draft as well later this week as well. So guys, make sure you stay tuned, continue to make us your first listen. Shout out to all my everydayers, and continue to make the Locked On Podcast Network your team every day, your first and second and last listens each and every